Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm Tiffany Wong. Massive crowds took to the streets of Taipei in May to protest a series of bills that would expand the legislature's powers. While the so-called Bluebird movement has since subsided, the bills were eventually passed, and the controversies continued. Taiwan is now waiting for a ruling from its highest court to decide whether these bills should be rejected. To discuss Taiwan's new legislative powers, we're joined today by Dr. Yen-Tu Su, a research professor at Academia Sinica, who focuses on the law of democracy. Dr. Su, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Let's first zoom in. What exactly are these controversial bills?
The reform bills have three major components. One on enhancing the legislative oversight over president. So the president would have to go to the legislative yuan to present a State of the Nation address annually and occasionally. The second one would be the enhancement of the confirmation process. And the third one would be the enhancement of the investigative power of the legislative yuan so that any acts deemed as contempt of parliament would have certain legal consequences. The reform bill will run through the legislative yuan by the legislative majority controlled by the Kuomintang and the TPP, Taiwan People's Party, and over the serious objection of the DPP and as well as the civil society. So that's why you mentioned the mass protest in front of the legislative yuan during late May. And then the president, the executive yuan, the control yuan, and the 1/4 of the legislature, mainly the DPP caucus, petition the Constitutional Court to intervene. That's why on July 19th, the Constitutional Court issued a temporary injunction suspending the enforcement of certain provisions in this recent legislative amendments.
So one of the ways that these new legislative oversight powers might be used is to have the legislature summon the president for what's known as a State of the Union in the US, but is called a State of the Nation here in Taiwan. How exactly would that play out?
Let me put it this way. The State of the Nation address is already a constitutional institution in Taiwan. It's just never been used. And so this time they want to regularize this mechanism so that the president will submit his or her State of the Nation address annually and occasionally when major things happened, or his or her administration want to implement certain major policy change. And so that part, the Constitutional Court actually gave a green light. And they did not suspend that part of revision.
Now it is in this Constitutional Court. Is it significant that it's there, and is there a likelihood that it could be overturned?
So Taiwan is a liberal constitutional democracy with what we call strong form judicial review. So we have a constitutional court similar to German constitutional court or many constitutional court in many liberal democracies. That court would have the power to invalidate a law, a statute, if it is deemed unconstitutional. And so it's a little bit different from the US Supreme Court because in Taiwan, only the Constitutional Court has that power to invalidate statutes. And also this time, the court is going to exercise what we call abstract constitutional review. That means without a concrete case or controversy, the court can directly look into the constitutionality of the disputed legislation. And it could hold the disputed law constitutional or not, and whether unconstitutional law would have what kind of effect in the future.
In Taiwan's Constitutional Court, do the judges have a bias or anything like that?
The justices of the Taiwan Constitutional Court are the only judges in Taiwan that are politically appointed. So the justices were appointed by the president, subject to the confirmation by the legislative yuan. So it's quite similar to the US Supreme Court or the US judges. However, whereas the judges in the United States, federal judges in the United States, they have life tenure. Here in Taiwan, they only serve an 8-year non-consecutive term. But theoretically, they are expected to act independently and adjudicate the dispute impartially.
You just said that all of the justices are politically appointed. So could you tell us more about the makeup of the current Constitutional Court?
Right, so the Taiwan Constitutional Court has 15 justices. And as of now, all the 15 justices were appointed by President Tsai Ing-wen in the last 8 years. And the interesting part is that 7 of them will actually leave the court by the end of October because their term will be expired at that time. And so, in addition to this series of constitutional showdown on parliamentary reform, we are already expecting actually a confirmation battle in maybe September and October.
So now we've set the scene. Let's zoom out to the nationwide reaction to this. Why was it also controversial?
Essentially 2 reasons. First is on the procedural grounds, the way the bills were forced through the legislature. Many people chanting, no discussion, no democracy in front of the legislature, because during the legislative process, there was essentially no meaningful deliberation in the committee review process, no meaningful public consultation. So that's the first reason. And the second reason would be a more substantive one. It concerns about the content of the legislation. And so on the one hand, people in general support the reform of our parliament. On the other hand, people do worry about that this power could be abused or weaponized for partisan use. It could come in a downward spiral of scandal mongering, conspiracy mongering, even gotcha politics. And people worry that it's not that good in Taiwan.
If implemented, how would this be different from other legislative powers around the world? You mentioned that the legislature might be able to summon the president for a State of the Union. Is that uncommon in other places?
It's actually not that uncommon. So in the United States, the U.S. Constitution, Article 2 actually stipulate that the president shall give State of the Union report to the Congress. But in Taiwan, we have different constitutional arrangement. So whether president had that kind of constitutional duty or not is in question, is under dispute.
So what is the relationship between the president and the legislative yuan in Taiwan?
That's a very interesting question and very important one, because what we have in Taiwan is a so-called semi-presidential system. It's somewhat different from the presidential system in the United States. But in reality, Taiwan is essentially a presidential democracy. So the president are not responsible to the legislative yuan directly. We do have a premier, which is supposed to be accountable to the legislative yuan. So the main controversy over the State of the Nation address is whether the president should be questioned right after his or her address by the members of the legislature in the form of parliamentary interpellation. Because for some, that would suggest that the president is responsible to the legislature, and which is a little bit different from the semi-presidential system regime we have in Taiwan. And so people, they have some worries in that regard. And while others suggest that, well, if the president simply gave his or her address and would just leave, then why bother? Because we just don't want to give president that kind of platform to address the nation. So that's also part of the reason why there are so many disagreements.
So you said the controversial part of that State of the Union address is the questioning, and that
Yes.
might go against the current semi-presidential system that Taiwan
Yes.
has.
Yes.
So is that a threat to Taiwan's democracy?
Well, this time during the temporary injunction stage, at the preparatory hearing for the temporary injunction, there is a question whether the implementation of this law would cause some irreparable harm to our constitutional order, because you need to have that kind of irreparable harm to justify the temporary injunction, suspending the enforcement of the law. Even though the Constitutional Court think there is, some commentators were questioning whether the court gave sufficient reason to justify that finding. And so some people would still disagree whether that would cause some irreparable harm. But from Constitutional Court's perspective, the ongoing political struggle, partisan fight on this issue would already make some damages to Taiwan's constitutional politics. So to prevent that kind of bickering, constitutional disputes, the court thinks maybe we should simply suspend the enforcement of the law. And regarding the parliamentary questioning, it's also a very typical form of political accountability mechanism in parliamentary systems. But this time, they try to make the parliamentary questioning a more effective tool so that, for example, counter-questioning or other acts deemed as contempt of the legislator will come with legal sanction, will come with legal consequences, so that the legislative yuan could levy an administrative pecuniary fine. So that would also raise serious constitutional concerns whether you can transform the questioning system into this kind of powerful tool.
So now what happens next for these legislative bills in the Constitutional Court?
Essentially, if the court invalidate certain provisions, then these provisions will be struck down, will be struck out of the law books. They will no longer considered valid laws. And so if you still want to have that a more potent, a more powerful investigative tools, you have to go back to the draw books and to redesign the system and make sure that it's constitutional. Otherwise, it will still be held unconstitutional by the court again. The DPP administration will also have the chance to present the reform proposals. And we will see whether they can reach some kind of political compromise in this regard so that Taiwan can move on to the next stage. But that's the best scenario. Worst scenario is that we get to see the escalation of political confrontation. We're going to have confirmation battle, and other confrontations later on. And it would make the divided government in the next 4 years very miserable for many people.
Thank you so much for your insights, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. You can find more stories from TaiwanPlus News on social media. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Start your weekend with a cup of coffee and a moment to reflect on what happened this week.
Hello and welcome.
We've got you covered, from defense and politics to high tech and the arts.
Not just to Taiwan, the whole world is watching.
You make the coffee, we make the news. Here's what happened on TaiwanPlus.